Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We'll give everyone a minute or so to get in, and then we'll get started. Appreciate everyone's time. We'll give everyone about 30 seconds more and get started. Thanks for everyone's patience. All right, let's get into this. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Rudolph Araujo. I'm the VP of Marketing at Awake Security. I wanted to welcome you today for this virtual roundtable, security for the new network, SaaS, cloud, IoT, core, perimeter, oh my. Much has been made about the long pending demise of the network, right? Yet the reality of it is the network is all around us. Only now it can be cloud-based, virtual, a host of Internet of Things, business critical SaaS applications. All of those are interconnected by the network. So, is the network really dead? Well, that's one of the questions we hope to kind of dissect today. And the reality is monitoring your networks is perhaps more important than ever because it's not one central place around a perimeter that you can look and keep the bad stuff out, right? So how do you go about securing this new network? That's another topic we want to kind of dive into today as well. So to debate and share in some of their thinking around this, we have a couple of great minds that we brought together. Ed Amoroso is the former CISO of AT&T and now the CEO of the analyst firm Tag Cyber. And we have Malcolm Harkins, former CISO of Intel, Silence, currently CISO and Chief Privacy Officer at Cymatic. And he's the chair of Awake's CISO advisory board as well. So he spends a lot of time advising the executive team and the broader team at Awake on what CISOs are thinking about, what their key challenges are, etc. I want to encourage you again, use the Q&A and the chat features to send us questions. We want to keep this very interactive and like a discussion as much as we're forced to be in a virtual world, but we can still keep it interactive. And we'll bring those in all throughout the session, right? So I'll be keeping a close eye and as I moderate this discussion. But without further ado, Malcolm and Ed, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Rudolph.
I always like to start with a softball, right? Well, nothing like an easy softball question. So let me start with the network is dead. Who'd like to debate for the motion or against that motion?
Well, I can
maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly say that it's obviously not dead. Changing, yes. And it always has been changing. It's funny when in sort of the early days of internet, maybe in the 80s and 90s when the internet was becoming a business proposition. Networking was primarily a hardware discussion. If you really looked at the way a network operated, the software was maybe the size of a golf ball and the hardware was the size of a beach ball. And you didn't notice that. I joined Bell Laboratories as a programmer and I was like, whoa, I had no idea. I just didn't think of it in those terms, but it really was hardware. And then that's all changed. So if you had to squint at 30, 40, 50 years of sort of progression, the one thing that has been very predictable and sort of monotonically changing is that now the software is like the size of a beach ball, and the hardware, maybe not a golf ball, but it's certainly shrunk. So that's clear. That is something that you can track and watch, and you can set your timepiece to that. But is it dead? Obviously not. I mean, it's just changing, and I know Malcolm has some thoughts on that as well. But change is both good and bad, right? And I'm sure we'll get into some of that today.
What do you think, Malcolm? Beach ball or softball?
Well, it's interesting, right? It might be a set of juggling balls. In reality, they're all different sizes. One might be a bowling ball, one might be a softball, one might be an orange you grab from the bowl in the kitchen, right? I mean, again, I saw that shift pretty heavily as well. I remember in the early 90s, there was a whole effort we called the Pink Book. It was re-architecting Intel's network because the CAD design needed such large files, right? And the speed with which that needed to move, just even on campus. So we had, LANs, we had WANs, we had, a metropolitan area network, we had lease lines, going across, the world. When Intel built its Costa Rica site, we actually paid to have the plumbing for the internet brought in because we needed the bandwidth. Right. So it's interesting. It's shifted, it's changed. I mean, from physical ports to wireless, right? Heck, even my home network has changed. We used to run Cat5 in the house, right? Do you need any of that now? No, you've got a mesh wireless network, right? So I think as Ed was talking about, it's morphed in so many different ways. And then obviously with software defined networking and the compute capabilities you can do and all the wireless stuff, again, that's further, in essence, expanding this explosion of the network, but in a completely different context to what it used to be physically with a box and a line.
Yeah, and Ed, you were probably at the forefront of this during your AT&T days, right? I mean, these days with 5G and edge networking and things like that, I mean, that evolution is not stopping anytime soon, it sounds like.
Yeah, I kind of think that the people in our community, like most of the folks listening here, probably do some sort of a security type thing for a living. I think that the security community is underestimating the impact that 5G is going to have on business, certainly smaller business. I mean, how you always think each generation of mobile network is just, I can watch my YouTube videos, faster and better. I mean, we measure it in these sort of very silly, not silly, but you know what I mean, like the capacity and speed. That's what those are the sexy terms. But what's really changed and what is a fundamental advance in network architecture, network infrastructure design is that 5G is a bunch of software, right? So it's a software defined infrastructure. So here's one thing, like for people who listening who might maybe never really thought about this. Imagine that if you built out the support infrastructure for your business, let's say you're a retail company and you build out your network and your ability to distribute and all that stuff, and you call that your 1G setup. And then a few years later, you think, I need to go to 2G, meaning throw the whole thing out and redesign something new, and then move everybody over to that 2G retail thing and still have switch back to 1G if you need it. And then after a while, throw that thing out and go to 3. You get the analogy. Like in wireless infrastructure, that is literally how the business and how the infrastructure globally has advanced. You've gone from, the early AMP service. I bet Malcolm probably had an AMP's phone. I know I did.
Yep, I did.
And then you go 2G, 3G, 4, each of them, it's a throw out. You can throw out the network. Now with 5G, I think you've got something that's more software defined. The reason I say that is because now you can make investments that have better payback. So instead of, hey, let's invest in the security thing in like a UMTS network, knowing full well that in 2 or 3 years, the whole thing's gonna be thrown out. You had a bad business case for these things, but now the business cases for 5G to build onto, like build apps in the network core that can do things, language translation, security, all sorts of things. In fact, the stuff that Rudolph, you guys do at Awake, likely to find its way into the network core increasingly. So when we say network dead, I see it more or less the opposite. Like I think now with software defined components, SDN controllers and other things embedded in the core, now is a great time to be investing in, if you're a vendor, invest in capability in that infrastructure. And if you're a buyer, to be talking to your carrier about, hey, what's coming? And it's not going to be this thing that we throw out in a couple of years. It's likely to be something much more persistent. So I think the security community should pay a little bit more attention to how much more software defined infrastructure is. It's not just, an interesting little tidbit or anecdote. It has real implication because that network operators can make better investments and better payback. And Malcolm, I know you know about that when you're
I think
it's about a payback.
I think you're totally right, and I think the other thing that it can be different for some companies, right? So when I left Intel, and I think there's certainly a lot of organizations that will still have the physical networks in a factory or in design environments and in office buildings and stuff like that. Though most of that again is started really heavily shifting towards wireless type networking. When I left for Cylance or even at Cymatic, being a cloud first, cloud native company, the notion of the network is different, right? We don't have the equivalent of LAN, WAN. We got wireless access in the small office and stuff like that. You might have, some closed wired network for some labs and stuff. So, but everything then, the network is basically going through things on the internet, and the wireless access you're providing in your office building. And certainly if you're in a small and medium business, heck, even if you're in a large one in a multi-tenant building, you're going to have shared network components in some cases. So again, the notion of the network is there, but it's different. Like when I was at Silence, we didn't really have a LAN. I didn't have a need for a WAN, right? So it was a different context. So you're still going to have some, I think, anchoring for a long time with the traditional network components for large companies that have campuses and stuff like that. And for other companies, just the notion of how they have a network will be completely different. It will all be wireless.
Right.
It'll all be internet based. They won't even have probably the same, concept of a typical LAN in many ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to one of our customers who was a big pharmaceuticals, and the CISO is working on a project where a lot of their manufacturing facilities now are going to move to a 5G kind of setup, because what they found was, given a lot of this is heavily instrumented from a sensor perspective, just the reliability of Wi-Fi wasn't where they wanted it to be in terms of being able to react to, because these are multi-million-dollar type processes, right? You make one wrong mistake and you got to, literally throw everything out and start from scratch,
You
because you're
scrap product if you have one little issue go bump in
right.
type of manufacturing capability.
And you're exactly right, Malcolm. I mean, what he said is like, look, this is the internet. This is not a LAN. This is not some kind of protected thing that we're running behind the scenes. It is literally the internet, and they work with their telco on this, and it kind of leads me to my next question, right? I mean, as you think about this, let's just call it the new network. As a CISO, and someone that advises CISOs. How do you think about securing this, right? Like, well, what's the threat model look like in this new world? Has it changed, or is it basically the same as it's been over the last, let's say, 20, 25 years?
I think it's exploding in so many different ways, right? Because you think of what's going on in the network. I've got a wearable that might be connected into wireless. I've got my phone that is, on one network, but also maybe leveraging a guest wireless access in the building. I've got my laptop. I've got the smart lights and the smart rooms and stuff like that. And even in the factory, you're starting to have more automation with some of the robotics, right? To move equipment or inventory around. You've got other sensors, you've got, so I think all of the explosion of devices and applications, to even what Ed said, and their use of the network is just proliferating, which means the network in many ways becomes more porous because of all those capabilities. And some of them aren't even necessarily what I'd say traditional corporate devices. They're personal things that are connecting onto a kind of a corporate network, even if it's a guest network for certain things. So you're having this, again, kind of blend of devices and activities. And again, even in the factory environments and stuff like that, you've got equipment vendors that are remoting into some of that equipment, right? And all that stuff, so that you can, again, extract people from the factory and have more remote access and remote management to things, which again just creates more connections, more devices, more potential incursion spots.
Yeah, and I think Ed, I'll throw this over to you, right? I mean, you brought up this notion of essentially a software-defined kind of setup now. Clearly that has a lot of advantages, right? You don't have to throw everything out, but it also software, can be vulnerable, right? I mean, like, what are your thoughts on how customers should think about this evolving kind of attack surface?
Well, it is a conundrum. There's no question that having things be more virtual does allow for increased flexibility and more maintainability and just lower cost. So those are the primary drivers. And I would argue that it also allows us to introduce security functionality more quickly. Like if I want to add protection during an attack, then you might actually have a prayer of doing it right during the attack. Live provisioning could even be the AI doing the provisioning automatically. You have a prayer of doing that in software. But to your point, we still have this issue that's been a nagging issue since the days of Edgar Dijkstra, and early computer scientists complaining about this. Software is still often pushed out that's written by people with poor training. That's still pretty buggy, and it's still very difficult to write code that is correct. That's still true in 2020. We all know that. We wouldn't be patching systems if that were not the case. So you can argue that there really is that that conundrum, and there is. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, making things more software defined reduces the risk to zero. It does shift some of the risk, but I think it's a good decision, because I do believe that over time you can get code quality much greater. I'll tell you a story in all these old stories, but I think it's appropriate. In the 1970s, the then Bell system created electronic switching, and eventually this 4ESS machine came out with its Unix operating system, designed by the Unix masters. And here's what the Bell system did then, and Bell Labs did. They stripped that Unix system down to a nub. I mean, just everything that didn't belong was pulled out. It was just this operating system running this cleanest, simplest version of Unix that you could ever imagine, just running the switch. And the design objective was for the thing to run, say, from 1975 and on, for at least 40 years with only one failure. And that's how it worked. In 1990, January 15th, there was a maintenance failure that caused a cascading problem. But you could argue that the number 4ESS switch ran from 75 till about 2010-ish, 15-ish, one problem. Now, here's how they did that. They didn't change the software. Right? There's no DevOps, right? No, adding features. You left it alone, and it doesn't wear out. Like, a funny thing, software maintenance is such a weird term, because zeros and ones don't wear out. It's the perfect.
Changes introduce risk, right?
But it's a funny story to think about, because you think, if you design something simple and you deploy it and you depend on it and leave it alone, it will run a very long time in a high availability kind of context. So when we say make things more software defined, it's not the software that's evil. It's our twitching around as humans. Add this, change that, add this, change that. That's the problem. and that's what tends to cause issues. So again, I totally understand what you're saying, and I know there's a lot of people who've come up and index finger to my chest saying, "Hey, Mr. Software, this isn't all roses," and I do understand that there are balancing arguments here.
It's interesting. Might be a good segue into another topic I want to get into, right? I mean, talking of things that haven't changed, since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. As both security professionals and people who have dedicated careers to security, but also as people that are on the customer side of this, right? I'm curious for your thoughts on why network security, doesn't seem to have evolved. Right? I mean, customers are still deploying IDS engines that were kind of built in the late 90s to look for patterns, and we can blame the compliance police maybe for some of it, but I mean, I feel like some of that is responsibility on us as security professionals. But I guess Malcolm, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts there?
I see it all over the place, in the network and in different parts. As much as there's been a lot of innovation and the thousands of security startups and stuff like that have come out over the past number of years, there's still an anchor point to dated security architectures, dated controls. I think people get lazy. They tend to set and forget. They are accustomed to the things that they've seen. They're accustomed to the vendors that they've done business with. Transformational change is hard, which is weird, because on the one hand, we're talking about transformational change on the network and 5G and all that stuff, and people are doing that. But why is it that on the security side we do a level of incrementalism? And I think some of it is because of the nature of the compliance regimes that kind of point you to almost rear view mirror driving, right? They kind of gear you to kind of retread the tire you've been running for a while. Some of it is the budgets and the skills and the staffing, but by and large, for me, I just look at it simply as a leadership failure on the leaders of the security team and the CIOs that don't really look at the efficacy and efficiency of control, and then have a strategic view. I think security teams are lousy at strategists. They don't do long-term planning because there's so much nipping at their heels. So it's a little bit of all of that. But at the end of the day, I go, it's a management leadership failure on the part of the chief information security officer.
Rudolph, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question, like the idea that network security hasn't evolved. I think it has. I mean, let's take a minute. Let's talk about the challenges, because there are clearly challenges if you work. I'm guessing most of the people listening to the three of us do network security. That's why they'd be on here. But I do think there's advance. Let's start with challenge. Challenge number one is that network teams are different than security teams. and sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't. Tell me the name of the company, I'll tell you if it's yes or no. It's probably flip a coin. Some of them, they probably don't even speak. Others they do. You never know. It's just, and usually
I hear if the name starts with an X, they don't get along.
usually, and look, we're all techies, and here's what usually happens when they don't get along. And what the heck, we're on a webinar here to have some fun, so I'll say it. It's usually the network team feeling like the security team doesn't understand networking. That's usually why they don't get along. It's rarely the reverse.
And sometimes that's true. I've had that experience.
Yes. So you do have that. That's kind of an organizational challenge. And as a manager, the answer to that, in my opinion, what I've always tried to do is you cross-fertilize. You like to see people working in different areas. You take people who are doing, maybe some cloud security, send them over and learn how BGP works. It might be good for them to learn a little bit of stuff like that. So that's one problem. The second is something that's less controllable, and that's encryption, right? So as more network traffic becomes end-to-end encrypted, when you're the operator trying to ensure quality of service or network security, whatever, you don't see it. And the reason you don't see it is because everybody says, I don't trust you to peek at my stuff. I'm going to encrypt it. I don't want anybody seeing it. That's valid. But the fact that you can't see it does cause challenge, because when you can see it, you can usually make better decisions from a quality or from a security perspective. Totally get it though. That's just a fact. So it has made it more difficult, but certainly not impossible. So there are challenges, but there's a few places where I think the network security community has made spectacular advances. The first is that network security used to be an entirely manual activity. Not that long ago, I mean, even like early DDoS was people watching, hearing that there's a problem, and then redirecting traffic manually to a bunch of scrubbers and watching these old Cisco guards and Arbor, and you'd manually figure out, is it working? Like, that was not that long ago. There's even some of that today. The fact that that's become so much more automated that's not a simple thing. That's a major advance, something that I think the network security community should be very proud of. And then let's face it, most network management used to be based on, I'm going to use the word dumb, meaning algorithms, not people, but there was pretty dumb algorithms. And now I see artificial intelligence being used, dare I say, effectively, where you're looking for patterns. It's not, this crazy AI that sometimes you see that overblows what's really being done. But the idea that you can spot patterns and learn from them and then self-heal and use machine learning to make a network more robust. We've also, Rudolph, you guys do that at Awake. I've seen it. So I think that there have been advances, no question. But yes, there are challenges. And then, yeah, of course, deperimeterization makes everything, like Malcolm was saying earlier, all the changes in network. But that's why you want to be in network security, because it's changing so crazily. That's what's fun. Who wants to work in an area where it's all well-defined and boring, right? You want to work in an area where it's vibrant and changing and there's unsolved problems. Network security is the place to be in 2021. In my opinion, I think don't tell our friends over an Endpoint, but I think it's more interesting than, say, Endpoint, which may be a little more crowded and increasingly obviously important, but maybe a little better defined than network. This strikes me as a place where it'll be more interesting.
You raise a good point, Ed. With some of the challenges that I think both of you laid out around, hey, what is a device? How many devices do I have? And then the encryption question. Actually, as I think about it, maybe this is an opportunity to bridge that divide between the network teams and the security teams, right? Because the network teams are struggling with the same visibility challenge in a sense, with a different perspective or a different lens. And so is this an opportunity to kind of bring those two teams together and kumbaya, if you will, or am I being a little too optimistic?
I think you're spot on, Rudolph. And again, this is where it gets back to having the right leadership on both sides of it, having the right strategy and architecture. And I think Ed is spot on with kind of the rotations between people. I mean, the network folks become part of the security team. The security team goes over the network team. You take a application security person, put them with the network. Why? Because it's becoming software, right? And I think you have to do that. And if you do that, you can have a more holistic architectural and strategy approach that brings the teams together, but also meshes some of those other things. Because as Ed talked about, some of the functions are going to get embedded into that software-defined network. So again, even the application skills and coding skills are going to be necessary to really do that in a complete fashion that optimizes for the operations of the network, but has the right security components baked in.
The other thing that I guess you brought up Endpoint, Ed, and I feel like the Endpoint industry has really, if 5 years ago I'd asked you who the biggest endpoint security vendors, you'd probably say Symantec, McAfee, right? And today those probably wouldn't even show up in the first five, right? I mean, you talk about CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and Silence, which is now part of BlackBerry, and so on. I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of evolution there. And is that just a cycle that you guys have seen over your careers as CISOs, that endpoint moves, network moves, maybe the log-based systems move? Like, how's that played out in the past?
Maybe a little bit, but nowadays, I'll use the example you brought up a little while ago, like having devices on a factory floor communicating natively with cloud over 5G. Well, that's something like if Malcolm and I were working on that, we'd go to a whiteboard and we'd draw something that looks like a device to wireless network to cloud to workload diagram. We draw that, and it's not completely self-contained because there's probably some dual homing of that endpoint onto a network or whatever, which is the whole point of endpoint security to
Right.
deal with those problems. But when you draw that, that becomes what appears to be this somewhat self-contained device to cloud problem that needs to be dealt with. And when you think of the pieces of it, you'd say, all right, one piece is the workload. And that's the application. That's why application security is this gigantic industry now, because everybody wants to help you secure your container, your app. If it's multiple of them, then there's using Kubernetes or whatever you're using at that workload level to do security. Then the second thing you see on the board is cloud. It's gigantic industry around, securing cloud, whether it's SaaS or it's Amazon or it's your virtual data center, whatever. Lots and lots of very cool vendors helping you deal with visibility into cloud and mitigation and policy and so on. Then the third thing is the network, and that's what we're talking about today. So it's a big piece of it. And if it's 5G, then the carriers are going to be the host. That becomes the platform. And all the innovation will go onto the software-defined infrastructure. And what's the fourth thing on the picture? Endpoint. And you probably should have some thought to, what are you doing? Like if it's a wind turbine, for example, and it's beaconing up to some cloud that like GE or somebody's monitoring, well, what are you running on that wind turbine? That's not an endpoint. And you look and it's probably Linux, right? And it's probably hard to patch. And it probably has backdoor connections, over who knows what for somebody to go in and fix them. It's probably a security nightmare. And that's why endpoint really is a challenge. But for me, I think it's IoT endpoint's a much more interesting problem than how do I lock down, say, a Windows desktop. That's certainly important. I know MITRE and others have all these beautiful frameworks that help you, gauge how well that's working. There's a lot of companies doing that. But if you're saying, where are the really, really, really hard problems, I think you'd have to point to IoT, as those endpoint problems seem to me a little bit more kooky and crazy than just locking down. One last thing I will say is that there's an interesting kind of thing that Malcolm, you may see, and that's with SMBs.
Oh yeah.
And most SMBs have maybe younger people like using Macs. A lot of them working from home, maybe working on Zoom sessions, just like we're doing now. Your day is you get up in the morning, make coffee, you take out your Mac and you get on Zoom all day. They're developing some habits that you just use you skinny dip with a Mac that you bought at the store with nothing running on it. B, work is just connect to something in the cloud and doesn't seem to be any security other than a code to get on Zoom. And C, this idea of, cybersecurity, gee, it seems pretty simple. It's just, I don't know, pick a good password when I'm going into some of these other services like my payroll or whatever. And it sort of trivializes some of the real problems that I think exist on the back end. So it'll be interesting to see how work from home affects and influences the way people work. It may be creating some bad habits. We'll see. But the idea that you just sort of skinny dip with a Mac on Zoom, there's some aspects of that might require some additional controls.
And to your point, Ed, I mean, I've had this dialogue, certainly with COVID-19 the past several months and stuff with peers that even though they had laptops and people had VPN access and stuff like that, they never, I mean, I've had a few people tell me, and I'm like, I was just hand to my head going, they go, well, we never really worried about the home network security. I'm like, hello. I mean, how could you not? Given the devices, the routers, all those things, and people didn't look at it that way because they were like, well, okay, somebody gets on when they're staying at home sick, or maybe a little bit on the weekend. But I go, if they were a target, if your entity was a target anyways, that individual's a target, which means their home is a target, folks. I mean, it would so frustrate me in the past few months when I'd hear and go, well, we're just now thinking about because we're seeing attacks from the home. I'm like, they were already occurring. You were just
Right. You were just not paying
not
attention.
looking for it,
Right.
right?
Well, it
You know,
allows you to build a model, like we said, wind turbine, 5G, cloud workload, right? And we say we've got to protect that. It's going to contain unity. You can't just have that data flying around. Now put CEO on laptop in a home network, with Joe Bag of Donuts broadband in whatever town you live in,
And
who
an
knows
Alexa
who's
device
providing it.
over here, the
Right,
smart
right.
TV that can listen over there.
Right. All this
Right.
crap going over a broadband network to some wireline network, again, to cloud, to whatever, maybe Zoom. It's exactly the same thing. You need end-to-end security there, whether it's the CEO or a wind turbine, you need the same concept. So that's where, Malcolm, all the work you do with CISOs and, my work at TAG, we would be coaching teams, look, build a model and write your policies to be independent of the specifics. And that's the closest thing I've ever seen to being predictive in writing policies. Because if you make the models general enough, they predict situations you haven't seen before, but it matches and you go, oh my gosh, the wind turbine, I do it the same way we did it to protect the CEO, and you
right.
feel very good about that. That's when
It's
you're
just
doing.
the application of the policy versus, like you said, the specificity. It's like having principles. They become, like the compass, right? That points you in the right direction, and then you walk into, the specific tools you need and the context, in those things. But you're exactly right, and that's again, it's an architectural and strategy issue, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to the CISO of one of our healthcare customers, and he said, one positive of COVID maybe that it is forcing people to think about what you do outside of work, right? Because with all of the contact tracing and, hey, did you run into someone? It's forcing people, and you're saying like, maybe that same mindset now comes down to security too, right? Because it's not like when you go home, you're technically maybe off the network, but that same device is coming back. That same device might be VPNing in, it might be connecting to your Salesforce instance, never hitting your kind of your core network, if you will, right? So, kind of switching topics a little bit, right? But I wanted to dive into something that Ed said, right? You've got a cloud security problem, you've got an endpoint security problem, you've got a network security problem. Part of me, if I put kind of a CISO hat on, is that that fragmentation, right? Is that something that bothers you, or are you the one who thinks, look, we need to have one solution that fits everything? How should CISOs think about this, especially as they go into a new year?
No, we're not selling coconuts here. This is a complicated business when you're a CISO, you're dealing with the complexity of both network and IT. Like when you're a security person, we were just kind of poking at the security people a minute ago, saying the network folks say they're not smart enough. But let's say something nice about security folks. It's not just the network team they have to deal with. They also have to deal with IT teams, which speak a completely different language. And they have to deal with compliance managers and regulators, speak another language. They have to deal with board executives and C-suite folks who speak a different language. And they have to deal with customers who speak yet another language. So security teams, while maybe they can't sit at a console and type a BGP command, they're usually pretty good at looking at complexity and figuring out how to handle that, how to manage it, how to come up with a way to unify it into something that makes some sense. So this idea of, lots of different pieces, is that a bad thing? No, that's the job when you're a CISO. It's taking the complexity of an organization, mostly virtual now, but used to be a lot of physical. I have a feeling that piece of it becomes even less important, but it's taking all that complexity, bringing some uniformity to it, bringing policy, bringing controls that make sense, and doing it in a cost-effective manner. So that is the job. This is not a it's not an easy job. It's hard. I think we underestimate how tricky it is to do cybersecurity in anything other than the most trivial environment. It's a really, really hard problem.
Malcolm, what do you think? I mean, is that fragmentation basically something we have to live with? And
Yeah, I think it's something that we have to live with by and large, but it's interesting, and I completely agree with that. I was kind of mentoring, coaching a CISO a couple of weeks ago, and they had just gotten into the role, and because somebody had left and they got promoted into it, and the CIO's request to them was, "I'd like a 3-year security strategy and architecture." A reasonable request, right? And so they were like, "Hey, where do I start?" And I said, "Well, did you ask the CIO about the 3-year IT strategy and architecture?" And they're like, "Oh, good question." I said, again, build a building. It'd be like somebody coming to me and say, "Hey, can you design a physical security set of controls for this building?" But you don't know what the building looks like. Is it the Winchester Mystery House? Is it a World Trade Center? There's no architecture for the building, and there's no layout for the doors and windows. So how are you going to develop a security system and architecture for something you don't know what that's going to look like? And they looked and again, I've seen that over and over and over again, to Ed's point, because a lot of times that IT strategy and architecture is lacking, and it becomes the Winchester Mystery House over time. And we're left trying to create a strategy and architecture for something that we are supposed to be embedded in protecting, that doesn't have the architecture and strategy. So the security team, by and large, has to kind of back their way into what they think it's going to look like, because that rest of the organization is not doing that work. And so it really does become again, I say it over and over again, it's a leadership actually challenge as well as opportunity for the security team to basically lead that strategy and architecture if it doesn't exist, so that they can then create the right security infrastructure and capabilities to support that. So I don't know, Ed, if you see that same thing.
The canonical 3-year plan for new CISOs: year 1, blame the last CISO, year 2, blame the CIO, and year 3, call a recruiter, right? And they go, "Oh, it sounds about right."
So it's actually interesting
job. It's a tough job. And I personally think that what's likely to happen is that within the space of maybe 10 years or so, I think you're going to find that just as every CEO has an HR executive reporting directly to the CEO, I think you're going to have some sort of a corporate risk position. I suspect it's going to include information security, business continuity, and maybe pandemic planning, dare I say. Continuity of operations amidst
chief risk
climate issues. And, you're going to have someone like Malcolm, who would have that well-rounded background, but would be reporting directly to the CEO, because this is hard. And I think we've underestimated. I think we also undervalue it. Malcolm, you know what I did once? I sat down, and I might've been watching football or something. So I had my laptop with me, and I went through as many Fortune 500 company websites as I could stand to do, looking to see how many, that posed picture of the CEO and the CFO, and it looks like somebody, they all look kind of hip and leaning on each other, or it could be their faces, but usually it's a posed picture. I wanted to see how many of them actually listed their CISO in that picture, because when you talk to their boards, and I know you do, and you say, "What are the top issues?" Most of the time you say top issue is cyber risk, right? So you'd go, okay, you would think that you'd have a position that's reflecting your top issue. None of them. The only ones that do are security companies, if it's a really high-tech security company, they will. But a bank or a manufacturing company or they don't. The security person is still low. And it reminds me of where the HR executive used to be. The HR executive used to be like a personnel manager. And then they realize, oh my gosh, managing people is really hard. And they bubble it up. I think the CISO position will be a direct CEO report. I don't know whether it's 5 years, 10 years, but it's absolutely going to happen. And COVID may actually have created
Accelerate.
a position
And
around
the ones
that.
that have done that have been big post breach things, right? Like Jamil at Equifax, I think he reports into the Equifax CEO. So I think, and it's a reactionary thing where you see
Right.
it in many cases. And I do think I've seen, there's certainly some of the shift where the CISO reports to a chief risk officer or the general counsel or chief operating officer. I've seen that shift starting to occur, but it's maybe 15%, max maybe 20%. Even in the Fortune 500, by and large, they're still sequestered
Yeah.
under the CIO.
You're
And
bumped down. You're not
yeah,
one of the top 10 in the company.
yeah,
Not, it just
but the
doesn't
scope
happen.
of the CIO is also less than the scope of the information security stuff, because I
Yeah.
think there's broader business
It
concepts.
is a smaller job, but it always, again, it amazes me. Like if you go to a board meeting and you sit and you might see like the controller or the lead auditor there, but not the security exec. And the security exec maybe gets brought in to give a
Once a quarter.
15-minute pitch right before lunch. You and I have gone through that a zillion times, but it seems crazy to me. Like I think that everyone will start realizing this is a mismatch. But Rudolph, it's to the earlier point. You were asking, is this, are we living with these problems? Well, the problems are much bigger than
Right.
that. This is a hard question. How does information risk affect the material kind of mission of an organization? And you ask Malcolm or me, and I know Rudolph, you know this as well. Not to be Mr. Downer here, but a good, well-conceived cyber attack from a nation state funded adversary that decides they're really not going to let up and be, persistent in attacking and not letting up, combining DDoS with malware with it, you're going to have a problem. Like, and it could be significant. And if they're attacking a sector like energy, we could see some things that are perhaps more fearful. And it's our job to worry about that. It's not my mother's job to sit home as a normal citizen worrying about that. But when we do what we do, we're supposed to worry about that. We can't manage to average case. We have to think, what are the worst
Worst
cases?
case.
And how do we deal with that? That's how you do information security properly. It won't be alarmist, but as engineers, we can't go, it's not likely, don't worry about it. That's for my mother. That's not for us. That's actually one criticism I have of the way government has kind of done cyber. It's a lot of sensible, what's likely to happen thinking, but that's not the way infrastructure providers do it. Malcolm and I were joking earlier.
I completely agree with you. I was having this dialogue yesterday again with somebody that I was coaching, and they had been told by, again, one of the senior executives that they were too black and white and stuff, and too fearful of certain things. And I was like, I've gotten that feedback before, but I, in a dialogue, Andy Bryant, who's chairman of Intel, and I was a finance guy for a long time, so I reported up through him. I remember one time we had that similar dialogue, and he's like, Malcolm, you always polarize these discussions. And I'm like, well, risk is a spectrum that's also temporal. And unless I go to the ends of the spectrum of risk, how do I see the middle of it? If I start in the middle, I don't know where it begins and ends. And so I have to go to the extremes in order to figure out those standard deviations away, out from likely, because I've got to control for as much and manage and mitigate as much risk as possible. Even if we accept it, I still have to manage it because it could occur. and I'm going to be responsible for reacting to it. So
Yeah.
the only way in which I could do that is to go to the edge of the risk spectrum to see the center and then see if my architecture and strategies apply, right? And I don't
Yeah,
think people
that's a
think
good
about
point.
it that way.
You know, Malcolm,
Yeah,
I spent a little time on the board of a large bank. And I remember at one of the meetings hearing, they were starting to talk about bank robberies. And I was like, bank what? Like, you mean like in the 30s? And I realized at that instant that bank robberies still happen, but none of us have to worry about it unless you're a teller or unless you have someone in your family. But it turns out it's very traumatic for a teller when that happens. They really do need a support structure. Anybody who works in a bank knows that. But for all of us, lay people who maybe don't work in banking, when was the last time you really worried about bank robberies? Like never. And that's the point. They happen. They're part of the infrastructure, but they're managed because everybody thought about it enough to. So
right.
I always think of cybersecurity as when people say, what's the objective here? Is it to get rid of risk? And we would go, no, that's ridiculous. Like even driving your car, there's a risk. We do it. You put your baby in the car and drive. But the goal should be to match what banking has done with bank robberies. Where they happen, yeah, like you go, is there going to be cyber attacks in year 2050? Yeah, it will be. But it would be nice if my mother doesn't think about it ever. You know, my mother, God rest her, she won't be around in 2050. But you know, for me, if I'm still around, I hope as an old guy, I don't have to sit around thinking I hope cyber security attacks, you know, take away my social security or something. Be nice if I don't worry about that, and let all the infrastructure providers and others kind of just deal with that. So I always thought that was an interesting experience
Yeah.
of bank robbery.
You know, we've got a question that I think maybe not in the 2050 horizon, but a little bit closer, right? Where you know, this gentleman is saying, hey, look, you know, I've made some investments going into 2020, and this was before the pandemic, right? I've invested in kind of the best in breed in on Endpoint. I've got a SIM. You know, as I go into 2021, not knowing even what my user environment is going to look like, are people going to come back into the office? Is this, you know, should I invest in zero trust? Should I, you know, where does network security fit into that puzzle, right? So I'd love for maybe each of you to put your CISO hat on and think about it. And then he has a part B to the question, which I'll get to next as well. But maybe we'll start with just the planning and the strategy exercise first. Malcolm,
Well,
you want to?
I think it's a great question, right? And I think, you know, as Ed was talking about, you know, like with the factory example and the wind turbine, you've got all of those components. And if you're not looking at your strategy and you're not thinking about how you're going to do something on the network, you're missing one of the substantial strategic levers you have to detect and prevent risk. And so for me, it has to be all of those things you always have to be strategizing on. And you can't just say, well, I solved this one and I'm going to opt out of the next one. It's a system and they all have to kind of be orchestrated together. And I get there's timing and budgets and staff that you can't do every component at the same time, but you have to sequence them. And if you've done the other one, then the next sequence is to do it for your network.
Malcolm is right. It's a holistic question when you're doing strategy. I remember we got hired to do a security assessment of some different products. Like a company was replacing their SIM. That's something that, like at TAG, we do that pretty frequently. Go in, help them figure out. But in so doing, we noticed they didn't have enough people working in their security team. You couldn't help but notice, you know, I mean, I don't even ask me, but Malcolm, you know me, you and I are the same. I couldn't keep my mouth shut. You know, like, it was just physically impossible for me not to go, what the hell is this, right? So they kind of listened, and it was sort of like time out on this thing. You've got this is your team, you know, and then the nature of the discussion changed and the strategy shifted from, gosh, you don't have a problem with this tool. You don't have enough people on the back end to use the darn thing. And you know how a SIM works. You know, people will buy a SIM And then if the data sits there, you're piling up, racking
That's
up
the
these
point.
big bills and nobody's looking at it. And then they think, wow, maybe we have a problem with the SIM. You don't have, I mean, maybe you do have a problem with the SIM, but that's not the problem. It's like, you buy, like buying a Ferrari and nobody has a driver's license. It sits there. You go, something wrong with the car. You go, well, the car is fine. So it's all this crazy kind of stuff, but that's what executive management is. It's looking at the situation and manage. You're not going to manage from some playbook. That's who does that. You have strategy and you have principles and things you believe in. Like you never compromise your integrity. You always treat your people well. You always focus on customers. These things never change. But strategy, you bet it changes. And you know you're not going to get the answer to strategy from some consultant. You're going to have to get it by paying attention and being, you know, capable and being thoughtful about what you're doing.
You know, and kind of it's a good segue into part B of this person's question, right? Which is, as I evaluate, you know, some of the claims that are made, and this is, I don't think this is a network security thing, right? I mean, everyone's got AI these days, right? What are some of the tidbits that maybe the two of you have found useful in evaluating, you know, claims as well as, you know, kind of the vendors and you know, going through a proof of concept? Any nuggets of intelligence to share there?
Do more than listen to what people say, watch what they do. I mean,
the golden rule, right?
you know, there's so much architecture out there. There's so much crap out there. Ed knows this because he sees this all the time. I mean, it's why you created Tag Cyber, because you're also tired of the crappy analysts that were spewing the same shit that the security vendors were putting out there to perpetuate the cycle of risk, right? And then just buy, you know, continue to buy stuff that didn't work. You know, you really have to dig in. You have to understand it. You know, and if you don't have the team and staff, you go hire reputable people who can help you evaluate the technologies, and you go talk to your peers, and you really look at it and go, what is the outcome that technology is meant to provide, and is it actually providing it in real practice, right? And if it does, and the pilot you know, efforts and proof of concepts look good, then you're pretty on solid ground to go ahead and make a purchase. But yeah, that's how I do it. I do that 360, right? I talk to peers, I look at it, but I don't just trust what people tell me.
You know, here's Rudolph, here's a little, just something that people listening might consider doing when they're considering not just a vendor, but say business partner or anybody in cybersecurity. And I'll even use Malcolm as a little litmus test on this theory. I believe that when you talk to the principals at a cybersecurity company or anywhere doing cyber, and if you give this weird sort of thought experiment where you say, what if a law was passed tomorrow that you were never allowed to make another penny the rest of your life? Like you just can't make any money anymore. And now go live your life. If the way you react to that is you're still doing exactly what you're doing now, like I use Malcolm as litmus test. If he and I, like Trump passes some rule that Malcolm and Ed can't make any more money, he knows and I know we're still doing that. I mean, we're not getting paid to do this, but we're still doing cybersecurity. This is who we are. This is what we do. And when you deal with us, it's not driven by this as a job. So when you're talking to a vendor, I always ask that. I say, why are you in business? And if the answer is, well, to get an exit and make money, then that's not your favorite answer. I get that sometimes that's all right, but it should be that I do this because this is what I love. Like this is who we are. And that's why you see a lot of the same names and people pop up a lot, because they really do believe in something and it's part of their ethos as a human being. So if you're evaluating a vendor, just ask them, don't tell them I told you this, but say, hey, why are you in business? And see if you get a dumb answer like, well, because, you know, most GRC platforms don't have these 3 features. So you go, no, that's what you do. Why are you in business? And if they don't know, I'd recommend you go somewhere else.
And when you ask them who their competition is, if they start with naming all the market folks versus the people that are the malicious actors that we're trying to prevent, it tells you that they're focused on the wrong competitor.
Yeah,
We're
you're right.
competing against the bad guys.
Yeah.
Right.
they should actually be rooting for companies in the same segment, because if you believe in that segment, then you should be saying those companies, if you're not buying them, please buy us. But if you bought them, that's good. And I can sleep at night knowing that you're covered. That's the right kind of thing. When you hear that, that's like liquid gold. Those are the people I like to work with.
We're totally out of time. I do want to ask one last question though, if you guys would indulge me. We're in Q4, so I have to ask one sentence prediction for 2021. Let's try and keep it on the security side if we can, but Ed, maybe rapid fire.
Well, I think election security is going to be a giant issue in the next couple of months, and I think you'll see a renewed focus at the federal level on doing it properly.
Malcolm?
It almost goes back to the webinar we did a few weeks ago with George Finney on ransomware. I would bet money in 2021 that we will see a ransomware attack, but that wasn't really the purpose of the attack. It was the distraction to the real event.
All right. On that, I guess not so happy note. Malcolm and Ed, thanks as always for your insights, the wide-ranging discussion. For the attendees, thanks for your time. We do record these sessions, so if you want to share it, it'll be up on our YouTube channel a little bit later today. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Awake Security webinar. And you can follow us, on social and on our website. Thanks everyone. Stay safe and have a great rest of the day.
So long, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.